Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Is there sound from this, so I have to project?
It just goes, yeah.
Okay. So welcome to everybody that's here. Welcome to anybody that's joining online. And welcome to anybody that's joining online in the future. I'm filling in tonight because we had a cancellation in our lecture series. And Dale suggested, I'm going to blame Dale, suggested that I fill in this spot because it was probably about just over a year ago that I interviewed for the position that I'm currently in. And I've been trying to decide if it's more nerve-wracking to come as an interview or if there's even more riding on the lecture tonight. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Karl Daubmann, and I'm the Dean of the College of Architecture and Design. I'm going to show work tonight that I didn't show for the interview. And nor do I really think that this is representative of everything that I do. But the question was, why don't you share with us what you were doing in Rome last year when you interviewed? So let's see where this goes. Maybe a way to start to talk about this, and I want to maybe I'm going to show maybe 3 projects that I did when I was in Rome, and I want to talk a little bit about why I was in Rome, what were the circumstances that brought me to Rome. But before I do that, maybe to frame the discussion a little bit as it relates to making, and think about it more broadly as a college that thinks about architecture and design. And when I say design, I think about that inclusively and broadly. So to borrow some words from Robin Evans, from Translations from Drawing to Building, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. He starts off talking about his brief period of teaching in an art college, that he was struck by what seemed at the time the peculiar disadvantage under which architects labor, never working directly with the object of their thought. And I would extend this to think about designers. And this is something that we're constantly thinking about. If you're a graphic designer, you may not print the book that you're working on. If you're a car designer, you're probably not manufacturing that car by hand. If you're an architect, you're often separated from the labor that you're working on, from the construction, but you might also be doing that construction. So this is something that I think unites us with design, and it's that we have a little bit of separation from what might be the actual work or the labor or sometimes the materials. And so to think about this, I think we think about labor, materials, that these are cultural issues. And I say that more broadly. What we see on the screen is an image that I've been using for a number of years, but on the left is silk. It's 2 patterns for clothing. On the left is silk that's cut for a Japanese kimono, and on the right is a French dress. It's not that one is old and one is new. They both happen at relatively the same time. One is from a book called How to Cut Silk in 1764, and the other one is Art of the Tailor from 1769. But there's a different approach to these, and that approach has to do with the value that we place on the material, as well as the value that we place on the labor. So on the left, the kimono, what is scrap and black, can also be used for other things. On the right, the scrap is waste. And again, I don't think that one is necessarily good or bad. If I say waste, maybe that has a negative connotation, but I think the labor in that instance might be valued more than the material. And so there's this constant dialogue between these. If we think about making and having worked as what I would say as a product designer, thinking about designing houses as products, the need to engage that process, to talk to the people that are doing the manufacturing. And what we see on the left-hand side is Blue Homes factory in California. And on the right is the making of, you can come on in. There's still some seats. On the right is Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion House, of which the only remaining one is at the Ford Museum, but it was out-of-work airplane manufacturers. So the idea was to recapture that labor and have them build houses. So there's a lot wrapped up in this idea of how we make things. And as designers, taking on this topic of how we make things can have real value. This might be what making looks like now. And thinking about repetitive processes, dangerous processes, and precision might be a way to engage some of this technology. This is an example that I use when I talk about maybe this separation of work. There's some graphic designers in the room. This is Durer's alphabet from 1535, and what I describe on the right-hand side is scripting. For anybody that's playing with Grasshopper, Rhino scripting, or any programming in general, what we see is a narrative description on how to construct the letter E. You form a square, you draw a transverse, you divide that, you add a circle. So if you follow that text, that explains to you how to construct that letter, the top left. So as architects, as designers, we have to often think about how to tell someone else how to make something. So it's not just enough to come up with the idea, but how might that idea be translated? If we think about it as in relationship to stone, which was some of what I'll show tonight, is thinking about those steps, starting with a block, using some patterns. The order of operations also matters. So an older process of cutting stone, that we see this. You guys were in the wrong class? Yeah. Maybe the robots tipped them off. So an older process of cutting stone in terms of automating that. Again, no safety goggles, no gloves, very little protection, and there can be danger associated with these processes, and what it looks like in terms of some places as cutting stone now. So being able to go directly, and designers and technologists have been talking about this for many years, going directly from file to factory. So what does that translation look like? If architects spend a majority of their time doing construction documents, what does it mean if we can just give the file to a robot to build something? Which was part of the question that I raised. So Dale also said, well, tell us a little bit about the American Academy, what was there. So I had a 10-month residency in Rome at what's called the American Academy, and I'll show some images from that. What you saw if you came in early was my studio space for last year. And what I proposed, the way that this works is that people make proposals every year, text on the left, portfolio on the right. And the question that I asked was, well, one, I was thinking, I wanted to go and look at the Baroque architect Borromini. Borromini was trained as a stonemason before he became an architect. So he understood the construction process, he understood how to cut stone. But I asked the question, what would Borromini do with robots? Which is maybe a kind of strange question that we can unpack a little bit. But how do we play with that process of processing information, sharing that information, giving information to someone else to construct something? So Borromini knew this well, and he spent a lot of time on his construction sites. So you make a proposal, you submit your portfolio. If you're lucky, you get a call, and you go for an interview. This is what happened, not to me, I wasn't on this plane, but this is what happened the day that I was supposed to leave for my interview in New York. A plane skidded off the runway and canceled all the flights. And I include it just as a way to maybe say, sometimes you have to go the extra mile, and I had to decide, do I do the Skype interview, of which no one else was gonna do, or do I just get in the car and drive straight to New York through a snowstorm? So I arrived at 4 in the morning, had the interview the next morning, and then got a call back a couple of weeks later that I was invited to come. Had that not happened and had I done the Skype interview, I'm sure I would still regret it. So this is about half of the fellows in my year. This was the ceremony in New York. So it's all Americans from all over the US. Sometimes I describe it a little bit like Noah's Ark. there's like two of everyone. There's two architects, two landscape architects, two artists, two sculptors, and then, so it's divided half scholars and half designers or half artists. Curators, graphic designers, conceptual artists, filmmakers, modern Italian studies, archaeologists. And part of it is billed as finding time to do your work, which I never really had a problem finding time to get my own work done. But I actually went as a way to think about the network of people. And I went to try and understand more about how different people think, what their methods they might be using in terms of their practice, and to learn from them, live alongside them. So we live in the same building for 10 months. So it's like going back to college and being in a dorm. And so it was really about that networking opportunity, that ability and that opportunity to create multidisciplinary relationships. And so some people may have attended, a writer came through in the fall and did a reading when he was here. That's a friend of mine from the American Academy. And so I think it's also necessary or useful to share some of this as a way to talk about what does it mean when multidisciplinary things might happen, what type of collaborations might exist, what might grow out of that. Someone described the American Academy as a university without departments. And so it's very flat. 30 fellows show up every year, and they work on their projects. They do projects together. I could talk a little bit about some of these things. The American Academy started in 1894 with from McKim, Mead and White, but they were smart enough to have backers like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Frick. This is the building that we're in. Betsy and Peter were reminiscing about the studio earlier. So you live in this building, you eat in this building. It sits on top of a really beautiful hill that overlooks Rome. And my studio was this building. Just like you show up and they're like, here's your studio. You're, oh my God, what am I gonna do with this space? But it's also amazing. So my friend, who's a painter, this was his studio. Another friend here. Alex, the landscape architect, was here. Sanam, the artist, was here. The other architect was there. So we had different studios all over the whole building. And so it does build on this notion of the grand tour. And the grand tour has existed for a long time. And it was a kind of European idea that you go to Italy or you go to Europe in the case of Americans. Often with the case of Americans, you could get sponsorship and you would go to Europe for a year or longer to look at a lot of these things. And so this was an incredible experience as well, to be in places where the director of the American Academy, who is an archaeologist, led us for a tour through the ruins. This is at the Colosseum. Or to be led through Pompeii by an archaeologist who's worked there for 10 years. And so the opportunities to engage these people, and every Friday we would do a walk in Rome, and the conversations that occur with one another when you're in a space like this are some of the most amazing conversations. We also eat together. And the culture is incredibly important. And so, and maybe to contrast a little bit, because I'm very critical about our food choices. About 8 years ago, the American Academy, their kitchen was run by someone for profit, and any money they didn't spend at the end of the year, they got to keep. So the food was terrible. No one spent any time together. Everyone went out to eat in separate places. And about 7 years ago, Alice Waters took over the American Academy kitchen. So if anybody knows Alice Waters, she's the start of the slow food movement, has Chez Penny in Berkeley, California, and believes in sustainable, slow, healthy food. And I'm not a vegetarian, but it wasn't until October that I realized that we were eating vegetarian. Everything was fresh, everything was local. So the food is a big part of this, and there's lots of wine. You can see the transition from dinner to drinks and sitting outside until probably late October, and then once it gets warm, eating outside again. And then there's an amazing cast of characters that come through the academy. So probably one of my most giddy days was when Jesse Reiser just happened to show up because he was in Rome for a vacation. So Jesse Reiser was in my studio. On the right, we also led tours toward the end. And so Billy Chen is on my tour of San Carlino, in the crypt of San Carlino. But it's amazing when someone shows up who you incredibly respect, and they ask you if they can take a picture of your work that's on the wall. I said, as long as I can take a picture of you taking a picture of it. So some of this is to unpack the work that happens there. And it's pretty amazing that at our orientation, when we went to New York, the director, one of the first things she said is, you've won this prize, you've won this opportunity. You actually don't have to do anything when you come to Rome other than be present. And so there was this kind of relaxing of what the requirements would be, but also a kind of liberation that occurs with that. So you may have proposed one thing, but you may find other things along the way. And so looking at, maybe thinking about Rome a little bit, this is Le Corbusier's kind of analysis of Rome and thinking about these Platonic solids. And so thinking a little bit about abstraction. Given the grand tour, lots of architects, lots of artists, lots of scholars have gone to Rome. And how do you think about history? How do you look at something that has existed for a long time? And what do you take away from it? And so in this case, this is Corb seeing these Platonic solids and these objects, these obelisks, these pyramids, these buildings that exist in the city. But I actually went to look at subtraction. And so a little bit the opposite of that. That if the city is so built up, where architects are very familiar with the Noli plan. So what this is drawing is the public space that exists. What you see in black is the kind of private space. And so there's this kind of carving or this erasure and subtraction that occurs at the fabric of the city, and starting to find that in other places. This is a manuscript from Archimedes' work, which I thought was just important to be able to talk about, as this might go from graphic design to urban design. Amazing subtractions of the graphic representation through the text. And this was also the software that I've been working with. And what's nice about this as an architect is to be able to model both solid and void and pass them through one another and think about it. And it's through this kind of facility of thinking about solid and positive and being able to just move them through one another. And so I'll show some examples of Borromini's where I feel like he had this understanding, but long before computers. So the other thing is that you know you're going for 10 months. And at least I felt the pressure that I would never have an opportunity like this again. So kind of every day counts, every hour matters. How do these days stack up? So there was a lot of thinking. I showed the video of the sunlight moving through my studio, but thinking about this kind of daily repetition. What starts to occur? What are the rituals that you start to develop? This was my probably Saturday morning ritual. The American Academy is here on the hill. And so lunch was served at 1. So I would leave in the morning, make my way across town to San Carlino, which is over here, and then be back by 1 o'clock or stay out and do other things. And so over the course of this walk, so the American Academy is here, the Vatican is over here. And so there started to be this walk that I would do. And friends started to follow me sometimes, pick up other people on the way. American Academy, Bernini Chapel, another church that I'll show you, the Pantheon, Piazza San Ignacio, another Bernini church, San Carlino opened at 10 a.m. So I would try and get, this would open at 9:30, this would open at 10. And then this is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa by Bernini. And so almost a straight line through the city, being able to revisit these different buildings and start to look at these types of subtractions. This is a Baroque piazza space, Piazza San Ignacio, where there's literally these kind of subtractions through the city. And you get these incredible figural void spaces. And other examples of that. So this is Kircher's series of drawings. Kircher was a mathematician and a musician. And there's almost this kind of drilling through the side of the building, so that on the outside, there's people talking. On the inside, there was a kind of bust statue. You can see this pipe coming through the back of the head. And then you would be able to hear what was happening outside, or you would also be able to talk into the mouth and then have that projected to the outside. So it was in these moments, probably in comparison to, say, an American urbanism where it's mostly objects and lots of space between them, here, there are these voids. And this was one building along my walk that also caught my attention. This is the back corner, the sacristy of the church. But what's incredible about this is that if a bird, well, I'll start with one other thing. There's a kind of mirroring across the corner. So we can see this arch, these two openings, another arch, these two openings. And then there's a sacristy space on the inside. And there's this amazing window that's actually back here somewhere. And so if a bird flew in this hole, it would fly out this hole. A completely exterior space. And this window is part of that tube. Right? So there's this intersection between one space being driven through the corner, and how do you start to bring light in? How do you deal with the thickness of the masonry? And so the architects and the designers had to think about these things. These are constructed. They're not built solid and then subtracted later. The architects had to think about solid and void. So a whole series of models, diagrams, drawings, looking at what types of intersections of volumes might be possible. As I would visit something. So I also brought a 3D printer with me, which is a kind of strange thing to do, where people on the grand tour brought a sketchbook and watercolor paper. I had a 3D printer. But it was this way of thinking about how do I transition from designing, thinking, understanding, analyzing, modeling, designing, and then 3D printing and proposing and speculating. So the models on the right-hand side of the table are thinking about this intersection of space in that corner. This is the Bernini Chapel that was a few blocks away from the American Academy. And what was interesting is these moments of slicing into the building or inserting these voids. So this window, which doesn't really follow the formal sets of relationships that we see in Renaissance architecture, here there's a theatricality. The light that's brought in behind those columns is to light that statue. But where you stand, you have no idea where the light comes from. A different example by Bernini. The reflection of light when you're standing in the chapel. This window, the light comes in, bounces off the top of this, and then there's a glow on the ceiling. So it's less about these formal relationships and much more about this theatricality and this kind of, again, the subtraction through the wall that allows the light to come in. So this was my Saturday morning, walking from one of these spaces to the next. So again, thinking about months, how many days, how many hours, what do you do, what are these rituals, what happens? I think I also started thinking about how do you work through iteration? How do you test something? How do you develop a kind of habit for these things? So what I started doing was photographing different spaces. This was in my studio space, thinking about the light and the way that that happened over the course of a morning. But also thinking about other types of habit, other types of ritual. So this is, again, connecting an interest in labor. This is scientific analysis of work. And other examples of where you might find traces that build up, that accumulate over time. So what I started doing was photographing the spaces, but wanting to try and capture the space as opposed to just simply document the space in a static way. So it was digital, and it's digital in that I took hundreds or thousands of photographs. I didn't have to develop film, I didn't have to print them. I could go back and I can start to reassess these. Also, with technology that you have in your hand, there's auto-stabilization, other types of things that come with a new camera. This meant no tripod. And so what I started doing was thinking about smearing the space, painting with the light. And so literally opening the shutter and then moving and doing this over and over and over. Each image that you see is one exposure. And so none of these are manipulated digitally afterwards in the computer, but they're all exposed in the camera. So this is a Bernini space, that same chapel with the glow that occurs above, that same church. But you also have to imagine what I look like in the space. Click, 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 or twist, or move, or move this way, as a way to look at what's being registered, what's being captured in the spaces. This is San Carlino by Borah, and spending lots of time in the space. And it's also, you get the change of the seasons, you get the change of the light. This one in particular, the kind of wispiness of the light as it goes up across the ceiling. And this, spending a lot of time looking at some of the details, and in particular this one arch, which starts one way, torques up, and then twists back down and moves around. So you start to get different spaces, different movement, different adjustments in the space. So this was part of thinking about maybe the sensuality of the space, part of trying to read the space and understand the space, but doing it with photography. But I was also thinking about geometry and thinking about form. And so a couple of quotes from James Blunt, who wrote extensively about Borah. And this is his words. Borah became for me a great master whose works were so subtle that one could go on examining and dissecting them, constantly discovering new beauties, new refinements, new ingenuities, and always in the end, coming to the conclusion that what seemed at first sights to be freaks of fantasy were in fact variations based on an almost ruthlessly logical method. And I would trace that back to Borah training as a mason and thinking about how you construct a space, and that the churches that we'll see could have all been constructed in that space with a string and an arc and equal measures. And so that incredibly ruthless logical method is something that was driving the way that I was thinking about these things. Looking at Borah drawings, again, as a mason, having to lay out that space, we start to see the center points, a circle, another circle, the construction of an ellipse based on equilateral triangles. You can begin to discern the thinking in the plan, in the construction of the plan, and the construction of the plan, the construction of the building is an extension of the construction of the drawings. So another view of those couple of arches that kind of twist and wrap up, and the dome that sits on top of this. This is an incredibly small chapel space. I'd say it's smaller than this room. But these other places, so if I go back to the plan, the image that I'm going to show next is the side chapel, an intersection through the wall that doesn't even really bring light in, but it just connects one space to the other. being at the American Academy also brings certain privileges, like being able to visit spaces at night. So I got permission to spend 4 hours in the church at night, bring my own lights, bring a tripod, and start to stage photographs. So this is with some big shop lights projecting light through that side chapel into this space. Or being there one day where the cleaning staff forgot to close that window and no one knew why. And photographing it at night, which is also kind of eerie, especially in the crypt. I spent a lot of time in the crypt. And it was because of these types of openings. And that animation that I showed of one void passing through a solid is the way that I started to think more and more about Borromini's understanding of solid and void, and the way that these windows, there's a registration of the windows on the outside and a different set of relationships on the inside. And in that thickness of the wall, these two things just blur into one another. So this is the window on the far right, which isn't even in the space that I'm standing in. So the window's over here, but this cut through the wall brings the light in and wraps it into the space. So this ability to play and just pass void and space through stone and through masonry was an amazing opportunity to just see these and draw these and try and model them. So this is San Carlino, Santa Maria Sette Dolori. And you'll see a number of different examples that look at this, which is a quattrolobe, which are kind of 4 lobes being pushed into one another, constructed all from circles. And St. Ivo, an equilateral triangle and a series of circles. So I started drawing with CATIA in the way that I imagined Borromini would draw, with strings, compass, and straight edges. And started constructing these small 3D printed models that were attached to drawings. And trying to think about how would I make this work relate to what I was doing. And so thinking about abstraction, that on the left, we see what can be the representation of one person. On the right, thinking about this more like the term that we use in architecture, a diagram, the smiley face can represent all people. So how do I move the specificity of looking at a Baroque architect in Rome to maybe the right-hand side to think about how it might be relevant to my work now? Looking back at other examples, Luigi Moretti did a similar exercise of abstracting space, a series of churches, and I think in Moretti's case, trying to take away the decoration to get to a very modern understanding of how to put space together. When I was in Rome, Andrew was also there. And so Andrew teaches at Penn, Andrew Saunders, and he brought scanning equipment with him. So it's a little bit on the other end of the spectrum of, this is the opposite of the smiley face. He was scanning the spaces and got 3-dimensional point clouds. And so here's the abstraction. Here's maybe the lack of abstraction, including the color and the changes that come with that scanning. And also thinking a little bit about maybe evolutionary change, populations, variations. So Darcy Thompson's work, looking at being able to stretch things. It was also something, how do I look at those variations? Maybe Borromini didn't do this, but he could have. Taking the rules that might inscribe his work and starting to distort them. So on the left, bilaterally symmetrical space with these circles pushing in. On the right-hand side, not symmetrical. What is gained, what's lost in that type of thinking? But for me, it's the same model. It's just simply a distortion in the rules. And so these were the drawings/models that were being printed and constructed in my studio. And this is maybe how I see them being related topologically. And so the relationships or maybe the size varies, but there's still 4 corners. There's still a series of arcs or circles. And it's just through their relationship to one another that we find variation. Starting to look at these as populations. And then there was one day, I guess I was sitting in the right place at lunch, the sunlight was coming through the window. I was like, you sons of bitches in the kitchen. You guys are doing this better than I'm doing this. So I can also disclose that my wife is a chef, and she moved to Rome with me for the year, and she was working in the kitchen. But to take another quote from James Blunt, once Bernini has bitten you, he never lets go. And so I started working on this project after walking into the kitchen and asking about how they make the pasta, how do they do this, befriending the sous chef, Domenico, which we see here, and starting to ask some questions. And so I think there's also, again, if it's like that moment of, do you decide to do Skype or get in the car and drive there? Here's the moment to breach that line and pass through the door in the kitchen and go in and start to talk to the staff and to the chefs. How do you make this? How did you learn how to do that? Why do you do it this way? Could we do this? So these are traditional tools for making pasta. And maybe the other one that we see here, a mechanized version. And so what I started asking is, could we make some custom pasta? Because there was already that relationship. And I could say there's a few things that happen in terms of the programming over the course of the year. When you first arrive, every fellow does a 5-minute talk, and you talk about what you're gonna do when you're there. Everyone does what's called a shop talk at some point in the year, and that's more like an hour-long traditional lecture where you share the work, and then you go upstairs to the bar and you have drinks, and then you have dinner after that. There's a mid-year exhibition, which this was the work that I did for that year exhibition. And so there was a curator, and we talked about a number of different things, and she saw the photograph on the wall that was the one with the pasta, a series of photographs like this. She said, you have to make pasta. So started looking at that. So how do you model pasta? What are the constraints? What's the tensile strength of dough? What type of dough do you use? And so here, really looking specifically at that geometry. And they're getting very, very careful. So in this case, the problem with this piece is that this surface is vertical. And the way that I was making these is a series of presses. And so this one changes slightly. You can see the addition of more geometry, more controlling lines, more ways to be very precise. And every week, for dinner, they made fresh pasta. So every Wednesday afternoon, I would show up with a new press and we would test something. This one was like hard to get apart. So this iterative testing, not being afraid of failing, not being afraid to go into the kitchen and having them laugh at you, and constantly testing these things. And so this is that. You can see the tear on the side where one surface cuts the other surface because that's too vertical. And so in CATIA, working on these things, starting to specify, okay, we do it, but it doesn't stand up. Make it a little thicker. We can stretch it. It's too distorted one way versus another way. So here it's 1 millimeter thick, and that's where you can see that section that's cut through it. And those lines also aren't vertical, they splay out a little bit. So this is the first pasta. This was the Santa Maria Sette Dolori church. This is the San Carlino model. And so you can see two halves. But I was also interested, this was in some ways an alibi to be thinking about collaborating with the kitchen, and it was also an alibi to be thinking about the hands and labor and how do you do these things. So this is San Carlino, and here's this little edge here, which trims the pasta as you put them together. Vertical pins are so that this aligns. So again, 1 millimeter thick. And as we're making things, this is like one of my favorite photos, because there are no rulers in kitchens. It's like, no, you guys got to roll out the pasta. We need it to be 1.25 millimeters thick because we have to compress it down. So I got them, we're testing. His hair wouldn't be in the pasta if we were making it for real, but brought a ruler and we would roll it, look to see if it was 1.25 millimeters, roll it again to get it right to where we needed it to be. So here's 3 of the early tests: Santa Maria Sette Dolore, St. Ivo, and San Carlino. So this was the process that was going on for the mid-year exhibition, and my shop talk was coming up, and it was going to be in March. And so we got the idea that we should serve dinner to everyone in the academy, that we would do the first course at dinner, and we would serve Bernini pasta. So lots of testing that leads up to that. Can the kitchen do it? See 2 different types of dough, egg on the left, semolina flour on the right. Do we dry it? Do we freeze it? Do we boil it? Do we steam it? How do we plate it? So these an early study, and again, an interest in the hands, that if we have to feed people at dinner, we have to be able to do this quickly. How do you register it? Those are those pins, thumb holes, and then be able to stamp it out. So this is also a sales pitch for the AIAS auction in a couple weeks, right? There'll be a set of pasta presses at the auction. So you also need a plate if you're going to make pasta. So this is a different Bernini space. I had 3 pasta shapes. And this ceiling was a really beautiful ceiling. And it also had these kind of 3 intersections in it. And I had 3 pieces of pasta. So quickly picking up on this, thinking about the hand, how the hand might engage the plate, how the plate might engage the table, and how the pasta might sit on the plate. So this was also an alibi to think about working with a local ceramics place in Rome. But you can see the way that part of it comes down and touches the table, part of it lifts up so that you can pick it easily off of the table. This was an early version, and of course you bring it to the kitchen, they're like, I learned this in Italy too. Like the sauce is just gonna roll right off the side, come on. Other version. Working with the local ceramicists and starting to develop those plates, taking them a 3D printed model and then talking through their process. And then also, what kind of sauce do you use? Again, thinking about the labor, thinking about the logistics, thinking about what's happening. Sauce would have been really nice and pure, and you can see we're also still trying to work out the structural properties of the pasta. But we couldn't do the butter sauce because you'll see Tiziana in a minute carrying the plates out. If we used a butter sauce, the pasta would fall right off the plate. So this was a red sauce, but looking through it more, you've seen some of the Bernini spaces, they're all white. So we have to use a cream sauce. How about a pecorino sauce that's cheese, cream, and pepper? White pepper. So white sauce, white pepper, white pasta. This was the menu for the day. La pasta Borah on the custom plate with the pecorino sauce. And then this is the production leading up to the staff, or not the staff, the meal that would happen at the end of my lecture, which was a little nerve-wracking because I was giving the lecture and they were steaming the pasta upstairs. It was gonna work. Tiziana carrying the pasta out. And so that work is ongoing, working with Brianna to develop for the AIS auction a custom tray that will hold the 3 pasta presses. So then the last thing that I'll show, it was the last project that I did, which was also trying to build on some of what I had seen, some of what I had learned. So the Baths of Caracalla, an amazing space, be able to go and visit and thinking about this. visiting the Appian Way. This is also along the Appian Way. There's a series of monuments. So then the idea, having been that I was thinking about Borromini all year, the mausoleum for Borromini on the Appian Way. There's a longer story, but Borromini commits suicide. And so he can't be buried in San Carlino. And so part of the story is thinking about a mausoleum for Borromini just outside the city walls. This is another, and there are all of these monuments, all of these tombs along the Appian Way, because as you were coming into Rome, you would pass all of these important monuments, important tombs. And so, building on that geometry, thinking about the intersection of these volumes, and starting to just work through the geometry and build on the geometry and think about the landscape, think about the space for the mausoleum. That's the Appian Way, one of the tombs that I showed a minute ago, and then this kind of open space there. How to move down through it and up into the space. This is one of the other fellows, so starting to paste the other fellows into the final renderings. But moving through the landscape down into this space, thinking about the brick, thinking about really starting just to collect things. So part of the grand tour is going and sketching and recording these things. So for me, this project is probably much more about my memory of things that I had seen and engaged, and those voids that passed through in different places. Also looking at going and visiting Ferrari, going and visiting, thinking about design, looking at all sorts of different things in Italy in the year, how to begin to incorporate these things in. Different patterns, different materials. And also trying to think, should we represent it as a ruin or not? And then this kind of in-between space as you move up onto the landscape, and a kind of depression and the space lifting up above, and then a view up into that space. So an exhibition is the last thing that happens in the year. So my studio space that you saw as you were coming in, tables of all of these models, renderings, drawings, pasta. And so hundreds of people come through the studios at the end of the year. And so having that opportunity to have that entire space with all of the work that happened throughout the year. So a view of that exhibition. This is what that work looks like now. And then I'm happy to take questions. San Carlino. So, yes, sorry. San Carlino or San Carlo alle Quattro Fontana is the one on the far right, which is also, actually I should have just said,
it's the twisted front of that.
I should have just said it's right there. Don't you see it? And there's all these kind of twisting and pushing of the spaces, and so that I felt like that's some of what gave me the liberty to begin to distort those geometries and start to look at their relationships and test their relationships, and what if it weren't orthogonal, and what if it weren't symmetrical? Yes? Did I lose or gain any weight? I did both. So there was lots of walking, but what was amazing, there was lots of pasta and there was lots of wine, but the food was all fresh, and the food was really good. And it was plentiful, but it was really, really healthy to be there. And then I had to eat all this pasta as a way to test it too.
Karl, when you're studying those geometries and how they're all coming together with Borah, did some of them I imagine are pretty straightforward, and then there are these eccentric moments when that don't happen with anyone else. And I'm wondering if you ever came to the point where you thought maybe he had reached his limits, or that they were somehow, I don't know, errors, or whether they were, is the signature of his work in those moments the impact of the eccentric moments?
Some of it. So Peter's asking about maybe do they start to find some limits or do other things happen? And one thing that I kept coming back to in the crypt of San Carlo is a tiny little chapel space. I may not even have a photograph of it, but I think it's a model for this space. It's like a very small version of this entry vestibule. And so in the crypt, it's only 6 feet wide. And so it's like a little prototype as a way of pushing these parts in and pulling them out. And so that was like another moment for me that's starting to draw connections from that. And also the animation that I showed of moving them in and out, that it seemed like, which isn't maybe to answer your question, it's not necessarily the limit, but it's seeing connections between his work that I think has to do with the practice and with the methodology that he's using. So it was really, again, maybe thinking about that abstraction, or how do I take something like that? And so how do you just learn, so maybe like the pasta as well, how do you learn a process, or how do you learn a material? How do you engage something? And then how do you start to test its limits, and does it work? And once it works, then how do you start to push and find the next limits that maybe don't work? But there were certainly some, I mean, within some of these, I'm trying to think where they are. I mean, I guess it's up for grabs a little bit. Does this go too far? Do you still see the relationship? Right, there's the 4 circles on the outside, 4 circles on the inside, but the relationships are very different. So maybe it does start to try and find those limits. There's certainly the limits of the software when you move one thing through another thing. It just says like, no.
Paulo Portuguese's book with Bernini, there's an amazing set of drawings of San Carlino about its development. And I just saw that recently, and I was amazed by that process of the lips getting shorter and fatter, and the little niches and how they change shape.
And I think there's certainly that history in scholarly work of trying to look at Borromini and think about Borromini that way in terms of the process of the construction. And I think it has to do with the narrative of the fact that he starts as a mason. And so some of those things would have been probably second nature to him. Janelle had a question.
So when you studied wood and you started to take his forms and manipulate them, did you ever use like Appian analysis or any sort of program that would help you decide if it was structurally going to work before you picked it, or was it all through material testing?
It's funny that you asked that, because there was someone that came through my studio and was like, this is all bullshit. How are you doing this? So for me, it wasn't, the question is about like studying these things structurally. And so for me, it wasn't so much about them being structural, because the reality is that the spaces themselves, if I can find one, are for the most part masonry and then plaster over them. And so they're not, if say in like Gothic lineage of trying to get this to be as tall or as thin or as light as possible, these aren't really playing that game. And so they're very thick shells. And so with my work, taking them and treating them as thin shells, which is maybe that progression of thinking of it structurally, was more just a way to try and play the game of being able to see it from the outside. But these Moretti's models are solid plaster. And so being able to cut them in section and see both the outside and the inside at the same time, and just treat it with a kind of uniform thickness. So it wasn't necessarily trying to analyze for those things.
And you just were representing it as a shell, you weren't, okay.
Yeah,
You weren't trying to-
yeah. And maybe the testing came with the pasta.
Yeah.
It certainly had its own structural properties. And so I think there could be, maybe in the control of the geometry, if one were to start to test them, you could modify it or find a range that was acceptable or worked or didn't work. Or
Do you think that was just because you had to use that material in the 3D printer?
So the question is, does it keep its uniform thickness because of the 3D printer? No, because I could have varied that thickness. I could have changed the thickness with any of those things and modeled the inside and the outside. And
You had to use the material for the 3D printer, you couldn't use like a masonry, because you were using a 3D printer to make these.
yeah, so these are all ABS plastic.
Yeah.
But there was nothing coming from the 3D printed that limited the fact that it was a uniform shell. But it was just, really what I'm representing is the interior volume. And so it was, by making a shell, I could see the interior and see that as a void from the outside at the same time. There's a few.
Could you talk briefly about maybe some of the things the other fellows were doing and how that affected your work?
Yeah. There are so many different things. I mean, it's also, the mid-year exhibition, there were also a group of us that got together, and so there's an archaeological also in the building, on the site. And so one of the out this kind of vessel, and then I think like 6 or 8 fellows took on that piece. And so the writer story, I did this kind of same process and modeled it and studied and thought about how it was made. One of the other scholars, so people took that thing on in very different ways, but there were some people that were there. So my friend that was the writer was writing his novel. It didn't necessarily have anything to do with Rome, but he was there to have the time. Another colleague of mine who was painting was studying things in an archive and then trying to find archive, and then he was painting as well. And so they weren't necessarily, there were some people that maybe collaborated more. I think for us, it was longer term conversations, and there's other work that's coming out of these things. So I'm co-authoring something about Bernini with one of the scholars, talking about different types of collaborations that'll happen. I think everyone shows up with work to do. And I think it's over the next couple of years that, because you live together, you work together, you spend all this time together, you travel together. And so you stay in touch with these people. And so it's a much longer time frame about starting to find ways to work together.
So it's more about the intersecting thought processes than exactly what you guys were doing.
Yeah, and some people went there to do work. They didn't want to be bothered. And then other people were there to learn from. I went for the network. I went for a way to think and interact with people and see the way that other artists thought and scholars approached their work. And those are still ongoing conversations. Yeah.
What was Bernini's influences of creating spaces? What was it mainly his stonemason background, or where did he get his sort of ideology of this?
He was incredibly, so the question is, where does Bernini get some of these ideas from? I think if you read from Blunt's writing, that would certainly be a lineage of him being a Mason. And he was born in what's now Switzerland, in northern Italy. And so he understood those things, but he was also incredibly religious. And he didn't charge, when he did the churches, he didn't charge any money for them. And so he just worked tirelessly on the sites and worked with the craftspeople and developed these things and thought about these things. And so it's hard to know other than through some of those drawings of seeing that process. Wow, lots of questions.
The back and forth conversation between digital and physical seemed to come very fluidly for you. At least you made it look easy. Was this a process that you developed before before you came here, like straight from the program to a 3D print, or did you develop that along the way?
I guess in a lot of ways, well, maybe in the way that I set up the lecture. So thinking about that relationship from digital to physical, always kind of questioning or never liking the fact that as an architect being separated from the work. And so I've done a lot of design build. I've looked at manufacturing quite a bit. I've done a lot of digital fabrication. But the 3D printer that I had in Rome arrived, I bought it and it arrived in Rome when I arrived in Rome. So it wasn't, I started working with the 3D printer at that point in time. And I was never really interested in 3D printing because I felt like it's more of an output. Whatever I have in the computer, I just get that as an output. But what was really nice about it is that these parts, to 3D print them, cost a couple dollars each. And so to have a studio like that where you could just have the door open most of the year and anybody that wanted to walk in could, having that work on the wall and being able to engage someone and have that conversation was something that was really beneficial about having the 3D printer. But I think the making was less about the 3D printing, and maybe the making for me was much more about engaging the pasta in that instance. But it's still that kind of separation, having to manage the logistics, having to think about the constraints of the material. These are things that I'm thinking about all the time, whether that be a building or whether that be something like a pasta press. You had a question first.
During your visit to Rome or your stay in Rome, did you have a chance to compare Bernini's work to other work that was done during his time? And what would you do? What do you give a credit for Bernini to add to Baroque architecture and to the coherent architecture?
I think, so the question is looking at other Baroque architects or other architects in general and then how I can use that work. And that's the pretty amazing thing. Like I wouldn't know to call that thing a quatrefoil if I hadn't been walking around a space with a scholar and starting to engage those conversations and talk about those things. And him saying, well, that's what that's called, and then being able to go and find it. And so there's lots of stories and legends about Bernini versus Borromini and what happens both in Rome at the same time competing for projects. And so there is certainly influence between them. For me, how do I take that work and move it forward? I think part of the answer for me has to do with that abstraction. Being able, I think one of the things we do really well as designers is to be able to look at something and kind of step away from it or see it from a different perspective, down its different parts. So these may not represent everything that has to do, and certainly the work that Andrew Saunders was doing up on all of the iconography, all of the other patterns, all of the other things that are happening there. For me, it really separates that out. It started to really just simply be an intersection cone or circle or sweep, and how do they start to relate to one another? And that's the kind of... I think that's one of the things that he does incredibly well, which has to do with the kind of distortion. And so there's a much longer conversation about what a church plan is, and then through kind of compression or stretching or distortion and how that happens. So tied to religion and tied to other things that are happening in church. But that's what he's known for really well, is that kind of compression and those kind of torsional moments.
I'm thinking about that second or third image you showed, Karl, the one with two tailoring patterns. It seems to me that in using the custom pasta press to make pasta, you followed strategy of the second pattern, whereas you have leftover pasta. I'm wondering if you consider going back and trying the first method to make pasta, whereas there's another set of rules that compels you to be as efficient as possible with whatever material you have.
Yeah. So the question is, or I think Martin is really great at saying, I did this, and I absolutely did, and it's because I was gonna make, the idea is a little bit, I'm gonna develop these pasta presses and they'll be for sale in a museum and they'll be like really beautiful stainless steel objects, which is something that's in the works. But it does that because the church precedes that, right? It is St. Ivo, it is St. Carlino. And so there was very little opportunity to distort those things. But I think the opportunity is to say, okay, if we think about pasta, and there were lots of discussion, the texture, the ridges hold the sauce, the shape and the geometry hold the sauce, and the waste of the pasta, of the dough, how do you reuse those things? And so it's, for me, the designing of the pasta was kind of whimsical and fun, and a colleague of mine that was there, he was like, oh, this is the crowd pleaser project. He was just like, because everyone's like, oh, Borah mini pasta. It's an a priori formal set of relationships, but I think there's definitely the opportunity to say, okay, how do I do that? But the alibi was also thinking about the hand and thinking about the labor and thinking about those things. So in a lot of ways, the Borah Mini Church just happens to be something to speed that conversation along. It's a kind of ready-made that I can just mix into that and use that. But yeah, we need some new contemporary pasta shapes. We're gonna work on that? Yeah.
You mentioned collaboration with the other fellows that were part of it. How differently do you think your work would have been if you just simply went there and kind of cut out the collaboration? Do you think it would have been drastic? Do you think it would have been diminished?
I mean, I think so the question has to do with the collaboration, how much it changed my work. There's probably less, I wouldn't characterize what I showed tonight so much as collaboration, but as learning from things. So people come through the studio and they talk to you, and so Kim Bowes, the director of the Academy at the time, who's an archaeologist, said, do you know so-and-so's work? I was like, no, I've never heard of that. It's a completely different discipline. And then buying that book and looking at, oh, archaeologists have been talking about these types of issues and other types of things. So it was more through adjacency and conversations and maybe fellows pushing one another and having conversations and things, less than the kind of joint collaboration. But I think there are conversations that are happening now about moving forward and working with one another in more significant ways.
Kind of a follow-up to that, Karl. As productive as it sounded, did that time attune you to some of the risks or dangers that are associated with interdisciplinary work? As we're trying to foster it, how do we sort of avoid the pitfalls, not just to it, but that it actually can cause?
So I guess the question has to do with the risks and the pitfalls of collaboration or multidisciplinary collaboration. Not, in this instance for me, not so much. And I think I tried to find a balance between my own work and wanting to advance that, conversations and networking and learning from other people, and then a kind of the third would be trying to get out into Rome and see other things and experience things. And so it was really, it's again the adjacency of those conversations about, I know when I took my friends that are painters to see San Carlino, they were kind of blown away. But when one of them asked me to talk about the ecstasy of St. Teresa, where she talked for about an hour about what's happening just within that one sculpture, that was also like mind-blowing. And so it was more probably an opportunity to think about appreciation for methods in other disciplines and for appreciation for disciplinary knowledge that I probably wouldn't have had access to at any one point in time, but I never really had enough maybe question that or take risks with what happens where those things start to happen. And you're probably asking about what happens when if those boundaries completely evolve, right? Or you lose the core issues within a discipline. So I think because everyone arrived as individuals and separate, a lot of those things were probably preserved, except where certain projects started to happen or other things might occur. Rasha. There's so many questions tonight. This is nice.
I went to the chef, and she was with you there.
I think part of it was, so the question is about the influence of my wife, who's a chef, on this work and thinking about pasta. There's certainly us going and eating everywhere all the time and talking about those things, but I think it was also an opportunity to engage, because she was working kind of crazy shifts in the kitchen, and so there were opportunities for us to think about these things together and look at this work and find examples and work on it.
When I was going to school here in the early 80s, I had a professor, Benson. I don't know if you guys remember Bob Benson. He had us go to these tombstones and these crypts and these different cemeteries to draw geometry. And at first we thought, this guy's crazy, what's he doing? You know, sending us out there. I thought that was the worst assignment ever. But once I got there and I started sketching and we started to look at the geometry, it was really an amazing experience. So I guess my question to you is, have you taken all of this and kind of thought about how to bring it into the classroom to give the students that same kind of geometry experience?
A little bit. I'm trying to teach I'm teaching a graduate design studio this semester, and I'm teaching them CATIA, which is the software that I use. That's like mixed results right now, because it takes a lot to get to the point of where you can do what you want to do. But it's also, I mean, maybe to pick up a little bit on what you said about sketching. This is kind of the way that I sketch now, and so I always. Because of the control and the precision, and for a lot of the things that I'm doing, it does matter whether it's 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees. And as I sketch, like I jokingly say that everything works in my sketchbook. And so it's trying to use that kind of precision, set up relationships, set up rules, and then begin to test those and use dimensions with them. And so very little, I don't have a sketchbook from when I was in Rome, but I have a suitcase full of 3D prints. Like in a lot of ways, they're my sketches that I brought back with me. And so I think it does have to do with part of agreeing to do this tonight is to talk maybe about some of those values and think about labor as an opportunity that we have to engage things as a designer. Go out on the shop floor, engage the engineer, think about the manufacturing process, talk to the contractor, learn from them, and then try and incorporate that back in. And so to the question about the relationship between digital and physical or digital and material, really trying to champion that relationship between those two things, I'd say is what I try and bring to the discussion for these. And I think it doesn't matter what scale that is, whether that be urban design or any other process down and that's this big. All right. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Ask it.